There is the place where in 1968, the mourners who came from everywhere, north and south, east, west, the rich, the poor, the famous, the obscure, to march behind Dr. King's casket, pulled on a wagon by 2 Alabama mules, a scene rich in symbolism. The mourners marched in the funeral cortege to the west side, over to Morehouse College, and some of them were quite famous. Bobby and Ethel Kennedy, Richard Nixon, Ralph Abernathy and Jesse Jackson, Governor George Romney, Mitt's dad, Nelson Rockefeller, Marlon Brando, and a young lawyer who had deep roots in this town by the name of Maynard Jackson. There is the place that is named for the philanthropist who more than any other person has shaped modern Atlanta. He was known throughout his life as Mr. Anonymous until just before his death in 1985, when he allowed that park to be named in his honor, Robert W. Woodruff Park. For a time, Bob Woodruff's office overlooked that park. Now, Bob Woodruff was, as many of you know, Mr. Coca-Cola. He was the wizard of this Oz. But he worked beneath the radar. He even hired a press agent just to keep his name out of the papers. And in this room, I don't need to convince anyone how a foundation or a group of foundations can transform a place. Woodruff's gifts to Atlanta have been likened to the de Medici's gifts to Florence, and with good reason, because to remove the gifts of Woodruff and his foundations from this city would have a Swiss cheese effect. Gone would be not only that park, but the libraries at Atlanta University and Emory University. Gone would be Centennial Olympic Park, which is right in front of us. Gone too, or at least greatly diminished, would be Grady Hospital and the Martin Luther King Jr. Center for Nonviolent Social Change, the Woodruff Art Center with the High Museum and the Alliance Theater, and the Centers for Disease Control, the CDC, which only came here because of Bob Woodruff's friendship with President Dwight Eisenhower. Now, the Woodruff list goes on and on and on. And so if you happen in the next day or so to walk near that park, Woodruff Park, I would ask you to close your eyes and listen for the rumble of history, Sherman's cannons, and the marching songs of the movement, and Scarlett O'Hara's reminder that tomorrow is a new day. Well, General Sherman burned this city to the ground in 1864, and it served as a cautionary tale, because this city has spent the last 144 years making sure it didn't burn again, and it hasn't. And that's a great accomplishment. The city's black and white communities came together in that shared purpose generations ago. You see, the historic story of Atlanta is a story of black hope and white pragmatism. And it's been that way since just after the Civil War, when the freed slaves and the broken Confederates poured into this city for a fresh new start. Now, it was in 1903 when W.E.B. Du Bois, sitting at his desk in Atlanta University, which is in that direction, wrote, "The problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line." And the flashpoint, that moment of truth, was the 1960s, not just for Atlanta, but for the nation, because the reality was that America burned in the 1960s. Watts burned and rioted, and so did Washington, D.C., and Detroit, and Cleveland. Boston seethed in racial fury, and the fire hoses and attack dogs were set loose in Birmingham, Alabama, and provocateurs across the nation spoke of a coming race war. In Atlanta during the 1960s, a city's racial conscience was tested as never before, and instead of burning, the city came of age. Now, you've just heard the remarkable emotion of the 60s. Depicted in song, and my assigned task is to take you forward from the 1960s. Now, I trace the lives of these families, the Allens and Dobbs, over the arc of 6 generations. The Dobbs, incidentally, are Maynard Jackson's maternal line. Jackson's grandfather, John Wesley Dobbs, was the so-called mayor of Sweet Auburn Avenue. Now, Dobbs was a race man in the truest sense. He was the Grand Master of the Prince Hall Negro Masons of Georgia. The Grand, they called him. And he was a remarkable orator, walking up and down Auburn Avenue, which was the hub of the black commercial district, Dobbs would quote from Shakespeare and Henry Grady and Du Bois, sometimes all in the same sentence. And on that day in 1948, when Atlanta's first 8 black police officers in their new uniforms walked along Sweet Auburn Avenue, big crowd gathering, Maynard Jackson was a wide-eyed, impressionable 10-year-old who heard his grandfather, Dobbs, the Grand, speak to the crowd about the power of the vote, restating how registering black voters was the only true way to freedoms such as this, and shouting, "Great God Almighty, look at those black boys in those uniforms." To Dobbs, this is no small moment. This was vindication. It was emancipation. As part of my research, I conducted more than 500 interviews, and I can't tell you how many times I would be sitting across the table from an elderly Atlantan who would say, "Mr. Pomerantz, where are you from?" Now, as you can hear in my voice, I am not of the South, unless Southern California counts. But being an outsider helped. It helped. Everything about this city was new to me, and I tried to understand everything. My favorite moment in an interview occurred when I sat with a fiercely proud Southern white woman, maybe 70, 75 years old. And you should have seen and heard her reaction when I suggested to her that Maynard Jackson, the South's first black mayor, was her cousin. Now, my research showed that this white woman's ancestor, Dr. John Miller McAfee, who was a Georgia legislator from Woodstock, north of here, had fathered a child with one of his slaves, and that child was the great-grandmother of Maynard Jackson. But this fiercely proud Southern white woman, who was wonderful in her way, just jutted out her jaw proudly like this. She said, "That cannot be." And I, being an inquiring mind, said, "Why not?" And she said, jaw jutted, "Because Dr. McAfee was a churchgoer." To which I said, "Uh-huh." I stood with both mayors at the graves of their antebellum ancestors. Now, in Dalton, Georgia, which is an hour's drive and more north of here, Ivan Allen Jr. stared down at the grave of the Confederate cavalryman from Tennessee, Ernest Allen, his grandfather, who had died young. "Do you feel a connection to him?" I asked, and he said, "Not especially." He said he felt more of a connection to the woman buried beside the Confederate cavalryman, his grandmother, Susie Allen. He had known her as a child. I took Maynard Jackson to a remote century-old graveyard in Kennesaw, near the famous mountain where the Battle of Kennesaw Mountain was fought in the Atlanta campaign. And there buried are the slaves who had watched General Sherman march into Marietta. And we walked together, just the two of us, deep into the woods and pulling back vines as we went, very dense woods. And there, for the first time, Jackson saw the graves of the freed slaves Wesley and Judy Dobbs, his great-great-grandparents. Now, I had uncovered Judy Dobbs' stone literally with my own hands, and in my research, I had found a document from 1851, which was the inventory of the estate of a white farmer who had owned 13 slaves, including a Negro man named Wesley. And that document said that Wesley, who was a field hand, was worth $800. Maynard Jackson was deeply rooted in his family, and I'll never forget his reaction. He saw the tombstones and gasped and put a hand to his mouth, and then he read aloud from one of the stones, "Wesley Dobbs died February 5, 1897, aged 78 years. Now, I try to step back and allow the mayor a very personal moment, and what I saw was the South's first African-American mayor standing in the shade of dogwood trees and scrub pines that had grown literally from the graves of his slave forebears. And I assure you, you don't see that very often.